I'm Claire. I manage the marketing here at the Roman Baths, and I'm joined today by Stephen, who's the Roman Baths manager, and Zofia, who's part of the collections team. So over to you two just to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit more about what you get up to.
Hello, I'm Stephen, and as Claire said, I'm the Roman Baths manager. I've worked there now for about 30 years, which is the longest job I've ever had, and no doubt the next one won't be quite so long. But during that time, I've managed to see an awful lot of the site and find out an amazing amount of stuff about collections. So I'm looking forward to being able to share some of that with you this afternoon.
And I'm Zofia, so I work in the collection, and I haven't been there for as long as Stephen. In fact, it's going to be 3 years in a couple of days that I've been at the Roman Baths. And I work with the collections every single day, so we look after the objects both in store and on display. And like Stephen says, I'm looking forward to sharing some of that joy that I get out of them with you today.
The item I chose was in some ways one of the most obscure objects in the collection. It is a fragment of a lead curse that was thrown into the spring nearly 2,000 years ago. And it is one of a collection of more than 130, of exactly 130 that have been recovered in 2 excavations from the spring in 1880 and then again in 1979 and 80. This one was found in 1979 and 80. And the reason I picked it is because, first of all, these objects are incredibly rare. And the spring in Bath has yielded more than any other location in the ancient world. They were found throughout the Roman Empire, but there were more in the western part of the empire than the east. And within the Western Empire, there are more from Britain than elsewhere. And within Britain, the largest cache is from here in Bath. So they are rather special. And because of that, they have been added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. Of course, no one has yet been able to translate this curse. It's thought that it may be the Celtic language that was spoken in Britain before the Romans arrived, but written down, probably as it sounded, using the Latin alphabet, because that pre-Roman Celtic language is not known from any other written source. We think it was thrown into the spring probably for the same reason as all the other 129 curses, which was that it would have been an offering to the goddess of the spring, Sulis Minerva, whose help was being sought by the person who threw it in, probably to help some kind of wrong that had befallen them. A lot of them are people who have experienced theft in their life, or had a recent theft, or had some other accident. And quite often what they do as well, and the reason they're called curses, is that they not only ask for the goddess's help in getting things back, or curing things, but they also wish terrible punishments on the people who have committed these crimes. So it's a very interesting insight to what was going on at the Roman Baths about 2,000 years ago. As I say, it is unique. It is the only text known from Roman Britain that survives that may represent the Celtic language.
So mine's going to be very different. So Stephen's gone for the Roman option, and it's an object that is on display. But I've chosen an object that isn't currently on display, but is one of my favourite items in storage. and controversially, it's not Roman. So I've chosen the Viking sword, which is rather beautiful. So you can see on the left-hand side a photograph of the whole thing, and in the centre you've got the hilt, and on the right you've got a close-up of the inscription on the blade. So this sword was discovered in Bath, but sort of north of the Roman baths, on the Upper Borough walls, which would have been the sort of northern city walls of Bath itself. Now, this is called Viking, but it comes from the period when the sort of Saxons and the Vikings are charging around after the Romans have left. And we're not sure whether it is Saxon or Viking, because to be honest, they tended to use the sort of similar kind of weaponry between the two of them as it is. Now, it's a really beautiful example of weaponry, and it's really special because of the black patina on the blade. So that dark colour is actually something that's added. It's intentionally made to be that black tint, and you can see that it makes this inscription down the centre of the blade stand out even more. The handle as well, it would have originally been sort of inlaid with silver, so you'd have had really fine strands of silver that would have been hammered in to the pommel and the hilt of the sword. And then round the handle you would have had some cloth wrapped around it as well. So in the centre you can see a couple of lines going across the middle of the blade, and that's some residue left over from where the fabric has rotted away. Now the inscription down the blade makes it interesting as well. So we can't quite work out what it says because it's a little bit illegible, but it's very similar to other examples that have been found in Europe, and they tend to be the name of the person who forged the sword. So it's usually a name followed by the words "me fessit," which means "made me." And there's a couple of different names that show up, but ours, we're not really sure who it would have been. They also span quite a long period of time, so it's likely not to have been one individual making these swords. It's usually sort of almost like a brand name, and it would have been used by the manufacturers that were making these weapons to kind of show that they were something of really good quality. And that's absolutely what they are. The blade of this sword is described as still sharp when it was found in 1981, and that's after over sort of 1,000 years in the ground, which is a bit incredible. And then there was some residue of the scabbard found above it as well, which tells us a little bit about what it would have been held in by the warrior who used it. And it would have been made of cloth, wood, and with a fur lining as well. Now, the circumstances of its finding are a little bit unusual. It was found after an excavation, not during the excavation itself, by workers who were building on the site. And it was found just lying in the ground. So that's why the two pieces are still sort of together, even though it was found by a workman rather than an archaeologist. Also, the place it was found would have been the surrounding ditch of the city walls. So it's obviously been dumped by somebody. Now, in some cases, this might have happened during battle. Maybe it was somebody running away, or perhaps it was something that was kept as a family heirloom and then lost maybe even sort of 100 years later. We'll never be entirely sure why it ended up in a ditch, but it certainly wouldn't have been your everyday sword. Although they're fairly common, they are actually quite rare in Britain, and it would have still been something special covered in silver and with this inscription down the blade. So I love it because of that mystery. Why did it end up there? What was it doing there? We know that there was some Saxon and Viking activity in the area in sort of 1013-ish, but there's no evidence of there actually being any sort of warfare or skirmish specifically. So we don't know whether it will have come from that or not. But yes, definitely one of my favourite objects.
What I've put together here is some images of gemstones, which were found a long time ago on the site in the drain that leads from the spring, but also from the baths themselves. And these gemstones would have originally fitted into small finger rings. And as you can see, they have some wonderful designs on them. Originally, those designs would have been cut by someone using an incredibly fine wheel, because the images you see are only about a centimetre or slightly more across. on their longest axis. So they've been cut with a very sharp wheel into these semi-precious stones that are in all these beautiful colours. So if you look at the top left one there, you can see that is a head of what we think is a nereid, probably a minor deity called Galini, and it's carved in a stone called Nicolo. Then if you look beneath that, you can see a standing male with what looks like a large round object in his hand, and that is a discus thrower. In front of him, you can see a large feathered-like object. Well, that's actually a palm frond, and a palm frond is something that was given to the victor in games. So this is a reference to a discus thrower, perhaps the kind of character who would be a champion or something like this. Looking at one or two of the others, if you look at the center bottom view, you can see there are 4 horses. One's a bit damaged, but behind them is also a charioteer who's holding in his hand a victory wreath. So this is probably a reference to circus games. So quite a mix of different kind of images here that represent daily life. Imagine these finger rings worn on your hand in the baths, and of course the water was hot. And so the hot water in the baths may have weakened the cement that held them in place, and oh dear, at the end of the bathing you couldn't find your gemstone. You may not even noticed until you got home that it was missing. So fascinating little objects. There are 34 of them known from the Roman baths. A remarkable cachet, really.
I think in terms of objects, we actually have what's known as a disaster plan, well, an emergency plan. So we have an idea of exactly the kind of things that professionally we would want to remove first, and the things that are the most important. Obviously, it includes objects that are on display, but it also means thinking about things that are in stores. And of course, we've got everything that has been discovered in the Roman baths themselves, but also all of the archaeology from the whole of Bath and North East Somerset. So it's a huge kind of varied collection, which has its own significance in lots of different ways. But one of my truly favourite objects, which maybe I wouldn't save in a fire first, because it's not likely to be particularly fire damaged, but I think is one of our most significant objects, is the earliest object that we have in the collection, the oldest one, and that's this amazing hand axe. So this is an Acheulean hand axe, which didn't mean very much to me before I started doing a bit of prehistory, but it means that it's around 500,000 to 250,000 years old. And it's actually made by a hominid, not Homo sapiens, but Homo heidelbergensis. So this was created as a tool by somebody who would have looked entirely different to us, but was beginning to hunt large animals, and they made it by hitting a stone with another stone, which honestly just blows my mind. We had a go at doing some flint knapping when I was at university, and it's incredibly difficult. So for somebody that we consider to be a different person, a different type of human being to us, to be able to make something like this in such a rudimentary way that fits into your hand perfectly, even all this time later, is just an incredible thing to have. It was discovered in Preston by somebody who was walking their dog. They looked down and just saw a different object, a different stone of a different colour on the ground, and thought, well, I'll pick it up, I'll see if it's anything special. And it has turned out to be very special, because it is the oldest thing that we have in the entire collection. So of all the objects we have, we've got a lot of important things, but to me this one's particularly special.
I think for me, it would be this, the Bow Street Hoard. Bow Street is a small street. It's only 150 yards from the Roman baths. But in 2007, the most remarkable thing was found on an excavation there. And it was a large hoard of Roman coins. And it was very special in many ways. If we look at Roman coin hoards found in towns in Britain, this is one of the largest ever found. And altogether, there's actually 17,500 silver coins. But it was highly unusual. It was lifted in a complete block, because at the time it was cold and wet and windy in a late November day, and it wasn't suitable for carefully excavating an object like this. And so the whole object was lifted out, actually with the help of a crane, because it was so heavy. It weighed over 100 kilos, and was crated up and taken off straight away to the British Museum, because we could tell that it would be eventually designated as treasure. And that duly happened. But it was good that this did happen, because it created the opportunity to investigate it quite carefully in a way that wouldn't have been possible with something just excavated on the site. And one of the opportunities that came up was to X-ray it. And by looking at the image on the bottom left, you can see the hoard X-rayed. And within that, you can see various discernible lumps. And what these represent are bags of silver coins. And we can still see that original shape there. And up above, you can see what happened after a micro excavation in the laboratory, where the shape and form of that lump of coins is preserved. Altogether, we think there are at least 8 bags represented here. And able to acquire it, and following a public fundraising campaign, we did an amazing project with the Heritage Lottery Fund, over 60 lectures, I think 17 road shows, 17 sleepovers in the museum for young people, all based around interpreting this hoard. And it's probably been the biggest single community activity the museum's ever engaged in. That all happened in about 2014 and 15. And when the museum eventually reopens now, this probably will be one of the first things I'll go and look at when we go back in.